to another episode of Real Grown Talk. I am Ari, aka Ari Limas.
And I'm Ashley.
So today I'm gonna go over some fun things. So if you're VA, either active duty, in the reserves, retired, kind of pay attention. But this is gonna be more for active duty coming to the island. We want to talk a little bit about, the pros and cons of military housing, right?
Yeah, I mean, I really just kind of want to get real about military housing.
It's a real talk.
To be honest, this applies to anybody at any housing anywhere. Sure. From my research, there are benefits and there are problems. So I really want to just talk about kind of housing as a whole. Basic housing allowance, which wasn't always called basic housing allowance. It's had different names throughout the years. And kind of just break down that whole thing. We have so many military clientele that we help all the time. And this is a major piece of people's lives when they're in the military.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I know that's the biggest dilemma, right? When you're getting someone coming to the island, it's so easy for them to get, base housing or something like that, something similar to that. And we want to tell them the benefit of buying.
Yeah, home ownership. So yeah, that's the best place to start out, right? Is what are the plus of living on military housing? I mean, well, there are some benefits, right? If you're, living that close to where you work, your travel time to work is, very short. Yeah. You probably don't have to go through the gate. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Some of the housings here are off post, but they are still military housing.
Yep.
And some of the housing is actually on post. So depending on where your job is and what your job is, you may or may not live in the same area. So even if you live off post, though, it's still very close. The military housing is still very close to post. So the commute time is a huge factor for people, right? I mean, especially for stay-at-homes. If you're a stay-at-home mom or dad or whatever you're doing, it's really hectic to be at home all day with your kids and then have to wait an extra hour for your spouse to get home and kind of relieve you of those duties, right? True. I've definitely been in that scenario, so I know both sides of it.
Yeah, because you lived on base or on post, right?
I did. I lived on post before, and it was just that. It was really convenient, but I did experience some minor health issues when I was living there, and I never really put it together that it could have been the environment that I was living in. But now with all of the things in the news that are coming out, it could have quite possibly been the water that I was drinking and bathing in. Just washing your hands is a problem.
Yeah, that's scary because it's just one of those necessities that you don't necessarily think about. Us being in the U.S., we don't really have to think. Thank God, luckily, we don't have to think about the problems with water, right?
Right. Usually, right?
Well, it's kind of an afterthought. I never think about when I'm washing my hands, is this water safe?
Right. So if you don't know, here we have a huge issue with the water coming from Red Hill being contaminated by fuel. So that's actually kind of one of the things that kind of started making me think and made me start doing a little bit of research. So I have these papers here today because I feel there's no way that this is a new thing. And that's kind of what I found out is it's not a new thing, actually. Housing has always been an issue for the government. Providing quality living for active duty and DoD civilians has always been an issue. So in the beginning, they really only offered housing to the highest of the command, so as time went on, we're involved in more conflict in the world. The military starts to expand, right? So there's more need for housing. Also, after a while, the military became volunteer service, right? So they need incentive for people to stay in the military after their contract is up. So housing is a way that they've been able to, negotiate that with people. Right. So started out with just housing for like the highest level commanders. Then they started giving housing to NCOs. So many years, NCOs are non-commissioned officers. So, you have your warrant officers and your officers, and they're like higher in the chain, you could say, depending. And then you have your non-commissioned officers, which are like your enlisted soldiers who are higher ranking. Right. So then years later, they're then offering housing to enlisted personnel. So what this has kind of created is like there's almost always been a housing shortage. They've always trying to keep the supply up because there's constantly a need for more and more military members.
Right.
So now we've reached a place where like there is probably enough housing. I'm sure they're building in some areas. They're always building. But then there's the cost side of it that the military's had to deal with. So not only are they short on supply for housing for military members. I mean, this is starting back in the 1900s. Like, that's how far back this problem really goes. Keep touching the mic. Sorry, guys. So, trying to move this down a little bit.
I mean, I also know that, especially here in Hawaii, it's a little bit more of a unique situation for housing because housing in general, forget about the military,
is expensive
and it's always in high demand.
Right.
The supply is not there. So there's always going to be a need for somewhere for someone to live. You have to have, if they're here and they're actually, they're stationed here, they need somewhere to live.
Yeah, as long as you're bringing people away from home, you're going to need to provide some kind of housing for them or some kind of scenario where they can acquire housing. So that's kind of how this whole thing started. So they start to get more houses for their personnel, but they're rushing. And the budget every year is either getting increased or decreased. So that's kind of the terms that they're operating within. So you can imagine that when they're trying to build houses quickly because they don't have enough and the budget keeps getting cut, it's not always the best case scenario.
Corners somewhere.
Right.
Essentially.
Right here they call it bleak living conditions on posts. And those are like the early homes, but even throughout time, that's always been a problem. Yeah. So what they've done is they've privatized military housing. So it kind of started out as leasing land to developers and getting low interest loans from the like FHA loans for developers to build the housing on post. And that, took away a lot of the pressure from the government as far as how the construction of the houses are going. They really just have to oversee the developers. But initially they were still stuck with, all of the maintenance and upkeep of those properties. Right. So now we're at this point where they've completely privatized it. And now those developers run these property management companies and they lease out to, military members and they take their BH. That's kind of how BH was created. You used to call it basic allowance for quarters. Now it's basic allowance for housing. So BAQ, BAH, same thing basically. Exactly. So once they privatize it, then, people are getting BAH. Now there's like a law that came out in 1996 that really like privatized everything. But this is something that they've been working on since like the 40s and 50s, privatizing housing. And it took a lot to kind of get to that level. Congress has been involved with military housing since the very beginning, constantly fighting for better living conditions for the people. So now we have privatized housing. It's run completely by the private developers. It's not a government entity. And the deal is, as a service member, you give your full BAH, right? And it's easy. You don't have to think about it. You're already getting this preset amount and they're taking it out before it even touches your account. So you're really just getting paid what you would get paid without your basic housing allowance. Mm-hmm. Makes it very easy for people. They don't have to think twice about it, right? But the issues have never really gone away. This like privatized housing thing has kind of created conditions for developers to sometimes I like to think they don't really have bad intentions. I don't know the fact of it, but I like to think they don't have bad intentions. But I think that probably what happens is they overpromise and can't really deliver, right? So a lot of these developers, come out with really great plans on how the neighborhood's going to look and how they're going to function. But at the lowest level, once these things are done, people are experiencing like lack of communication from the property managers and just kind of rough living conditions in some areas. So now what we're experiencing are things like the Red Hill water situation. The government's not really speaking on it too much. They haven't really admitted to much, but people who, work even at the board of water supply know how the water system works. There's fuel in the water. There's fuel leaking. The fuel lines run just above where the water lines are. So if there's any fuel leaking, it's likely to contaminate the water. This water pretty much feeds Pearl Harbor, AMR, which is a housing development here. There's another housing development in Pearl City, another one in Eva Beach, and all these homes are affected by the water.
Yeah, it's a big. I actually had friends in the military. They couldn't stay at their houses.
Yeah,
They literally got put up in hotels in Waikiki.
right.
Like, yeah, I don't shower. I don't use the water to wash my hands.
Right.
Obviously, go to the bathroom. That's not going to affect you, but it's a real thing, and it's crazy. And knowing how this island is, and essentially all this stuff was built. The infrastructure was just built just for military, right?
Well, if we're talking about the fuel lines and the water in these areas, yes. So it seems as though they've, run these water lines in those times pre-World War II where they were getting ready for housing. They're trying to build up housing. And at the same time, World War II is about to kick off. I guess the military realized we need fuel and we need it fast. So they're running it through the same areas where they're running the water lines.
Because they moved.
The infrastructure is built already.
Exactly. They moved their main base from the West Coast to Hawaii so they could be closer because of, what happened at
Pearl Harbor.
Pearl Harbor. And even a little bit before that, they moved their fleet over to Hawaii. And then you get that influx of people so quick. Things, unfortunately, are not going to be done in the correct manner.
Right. A lot of things rush.
A little bit overseen, and that's what problems we're seeing now. It's,
Right. And it's like, how do you go backwards?
70 years later.
They have to make huge changes to even fix it, right? And all of those people are back in their houses, by the way, but the problem hasn't gone away. The fuel hasn't been shut down. I mean, once they shut it down, it's still going to take like over a month to drain the tanks or something like that. I don't know the exact number of days, but it takes a long time, even once they decide to make the changes, for those changes to actually start happening and actually affect the people. So outside of the water issue, I mean, common problems that people are having all over the U.S. are mold, really bad mold problems. And obviously we know the effects of mold, if you live in a moldy environment, very bad for your health.
Yeah, respiratory things and, infections and things like that. So, I mean, that's a pretty big, downfall. I mean, you went from like the benefit to pretty big.
Yeah, like in my opinion, the negatives definitely outweigh the benefits. It's nice that it's mindless and the money comes out every month and you're so close to work. That's really cool, but
is it worth your health?
Is it worth your health? And that's not even touching on the financial aspect, right?
Yeah.
So, like here we get a really high BAH. Well, I say we, but my husband's not active duty anymore. But service members here, it's a lot. It's a lot of money. By the time you leave here, it's like over $100,000.
It just went up.
Yeah, yeah.
So you're getting more. And, that to turn it into what we do is, like it's easy, right? It's accessible, base housing. But then, are you here? Why are you here? How long are you here for? Kind of also is a part of why we tell you should be buying.
Yeah.
Because if you're here for 3 years, you said something upwards of $100,000, and you'd be spending on BAH, either renting or being on post. You could actually be investing in that into your home, living here, and not having to deal with all those things you're talking about with the mold, the water situation.
Right. Some people are like huge complaints of rodents. Man, there's a couple other things. So, like, the government's trying to combat this. It's not like they don't care, I would say. They created this whole new organization to double check on everything, essentially, because there's a lot of things that the DoD overlooks. DoD runs all of the housing. That's all of their Department of Defense is actually in charge of all of this and to oversee all this privatized housing. But a lot of stuff is getting through the cracks, obviously.
Yep.
There was some huge lawsuits that went against some of the developers. A couple that did some of the mainland housings. There's like 200 military posts, and there's only so many developers that actually build these communities, So like the other problem is, because it is privatized, for these changes to go in effect, like with this new organization that's double checking the DoD standards and all these things, the developers actually have to agree to them to implement them because they're privatized. They own it all, essentially.
Totally different.
Yeah, so it's not just up to the government to pass this and now they can just run everything with the housing. It has to be approved by the developers as well. So there still are like 5 developers out there. As of 2022, is the latest research I could find on this. There are still 5 developers out there that haven't agreed to the terms of the new laws that have been passed in 2020. So anywhere where those developers are in charge of housing, you're not going to see those changes in effect, which a lot of them are recommendations on mold and rodents and everything we just talked about. There were even a couple of developers that were found guilty of fraud and had to pay millions back to the government because of the issues that they're having and then not following up on those issues.
That's crazy.
It's mind blown, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I know, my thing about base housing was kind of limited until I found out my friend in the whole Red Hill thing here in Hawaii, and she was like, I came and used the water.
Yeah, you can't wash your hands.
And then even before anyone was told, you were still doing it, and you're getting rashes and getting all these crazy things. So that kind of, made me even more knowledgeable on the fact of, base housing isn't always the best fit for you.
Yeah, and it's I would say it's not on purpose by anyone. It's just, it's really hard for the government to house how many hundreds of thousands of people when we have all of these other things that the government's also taking care of, right?
Where's on the priority list? You know what I mean?
I'm sure it's high up on the priority list, but I'm sure they probably, there's so much money going to everything in the government, right? It's they're just chipping away at it, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what their plans are. They haven't communicated what their plans are, with Red Hill. But I mean, I know that it's something that's constantly being talked about, right? We hear about it a lot, but we don't really hear the government commenting on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely a big issue, and, just knowing, like I said, knowing more in personal situations, I'm like, oh, wow, you want to move on post, okay, cool.
Yeah.
But here's the reasons why. Not that you shouldn't, but here's kind of pros and cons, and then you start bringing out what we do again.
Yeah.
In the real estate, you kind of show that you're actually adding value to your life.
Yeah. I don't want to say that anyone shouldn't live on post, but what I will say is you should be buying a house everywhere you're stationed.
Oh, yeah.
That's how your higher-ups are retiring comfortably.
Easily.
And that's how people that are normal humans like me and you are achieving the dream of buying that dream house.
Yep.
It's through equity. It's for savings. At the minimum, just buy a house every duty station. Even if you don't buy a house from me, I don't care. You should be buying a house at your next duty station, at the one after that. As long as you're going to be in the military, keep buying a house if you can. Yep.
The benefit of the VA loan is incredible. And, we say this all the time, but, you could build generational wealth
right.
over and over and over again. You're chilling. You're going to retire.
Right.
So let's just say you had 5 duty stations through your military career. You have a place there every time.
Right.
You're renting it out. You're going to get retirement from when you retire, and then all these rental incomes.
Yep. You're going to be cash flowing.
Exactly.
And I've done this before. When my husband was active duty, we did buy a house at the only other place that we were stationed. We did buy a house here. And one thing that I learned is that having a house near a military post is highly rentable. You constantly have people coming in and out of those areas. because there's always people moving and always people moving in, right? There's people moving out, people moving in constantly. The best thing you can do is do your research, find yourself the most reputable property manager that you can find in your area. You know, make sure you check them out. You don't want just any like Joe Schmo renting your place out. You want someone with like a good history, you know, because what I experienced is I did that. I did my research, chose one of the top realtors in the area for property management, and my house was never empty. I mean, as soon as one person would move out, I would be surprised if it was on the market for a week after. Would be a long time.
That's awesome.
And they always vetted the people, did all the checks that they do to make sure that, you know, you're getting quality renters in there. And that was the best thing I could have ever done.
You can't do that with base housing.
You can't do that with basic.
No, that was really interesting. Definitely super informative in terms of what base housing, especially from you, from a first person perspective, and then from me, somebody who didn't really know much about base housing. You know,
Right.
my cousin was in the military, but he always rented off post.
I was going to ask you about that, actually.
He was always like, "Oh yeah, you know, I can." Essentially, because they give you your BH, so whatever you want to go do,
Right.
in terms of what do you want to rent, it's more in your hand.
Yeah. That's the cool thing about privatized housing is that, you know, people used to be forced to live on post when they worked in the military, right? So now that there is privatized housing, there is BH, it's your choice what you want to do with it. And, like, why not recoup those dollars that you're essentially getting for free? I mean, you're not even taxed on that money. So it's like the only way you can get that back is by putting it into your own place and, you know, utilizing your equity however you want or cash flowing, whatever your plan is when you leave. There's definitely a way to do it.
Yeah. So the last thing I want to say is there's options.
Yeah.
You come to the island. Like I said, anybody who's a veteran that's gonna be here or is here already, that's renting or on post, just hit us up. And like I said, we're knowledgeable about the situations and, you know, the housing market, and we definitely know what we're talking about.
Yeah. We're here to help.
Cool.
Make it easy.
Sweet.
Yeah, this was really fun.
Yeah.
Bye, guys.